Welcome to episode 14 of us trying to build a Lamborghini replica. 14. Oh my god, 14 episodes in. And we're still not nearly at the point where someone can walk in and be like, oh my god, for real? You've almost finished the car. We've already designed a front suspension with one wheel mounted pretty much like it should be, even though it isn't mounted. Now we need to copy and paste the suspension from left to right, which seems like a simple enough task. We are making progress with the cage. You know, in this episode, I expect us to finish work on all of the metal bits, to place the car onto its wheels, so that next time we can move on to mounting the engine, sorting the wiring, piecing together a floor and such. We've got everything set up for the engine. All we have to do is lower it in and bolt it down. After that, this should start to go much quicker. The only thing that might potentially slow us down is the Lambo scissor doors. Nobody really knows what might slow us down. The rule around here is to solve problems as they come. The way I see it right now, nothing is getting in the way. All of this seems fairly straightforward, and so let's get straight to work. Gentlemen, Igor is having a meltdown again, and this time it is really serious. It appears that he made a few mistakes when welding. You mind telling us? I got everything right. It's just that we keep adding new stuff. For example, now we've added a steering rack, and that doesn't quite fit inside our subframe. It interferes with the suspension link axes. To make a long story short, the subframe isn't allowing us to mount the steering rack. So essentially, we need to chop off this bit to make room for the steering rack, correct? It's meant to be precisely in line with the steering arms. Oh my god, this is infuriating. Just when we're getting somewhere. It's impossible to think everything through. Good thing you didn't finish welding it. Our method works, I mean where we spot weld without doing anything permanently. At the very least, it doesn't hurt as much when you cut stuff, as opposed to when you've spent some time on the welds. I don't think it's that big of an issue, since we do have a couple of mounting points for the link anyway. It's just that we had a nice symmetry going, we had it carefully measured out, but now we have to chop it. That's completely normal practice when putting together a Lamborghini. How hard was it to copy and paste the suspension? It was incredibly difficult. Copying it was even harder than making what we had. What was the problem? Getting the angles right. Well, it's obviously not going to have the correct angles. There's no way you can drive the car like this. It will need an alignment, but in order to minimize the work we'll need to put in while doing that alignment, I did what I could to even things out. In your own estimation, were you successful in doing so? Well, at the very least, the caster is identical. Toe, camber, it all looks about the same. Overall, there shouldn't be any critical issues. Can I ask why instead of setting up the horizontal strut, you went straight for the steering rack? It's all due to a minor discrepancy with the ball bearing. Now you see, the problem is that the bearing is meant to be 14 mil on the inside when in fact we've got a 15 mil. It's a 202 grade bearing that's supposed to sit on a 14 mil shaft, but I didn't notice it had a groove in it, so when you start posing difficult questions to Igor like why didn't you do this, he starts throwing specialized terms at you. Groove freaking shaft with a 14. I went to a store earlier today and asked for a bearing with an internal diameter of 14 mil. They told me they didn't have any. Like, you can have a 13 or a 15, but those we don't keep in stock. They did find a bearing from some Chinese alternator, which is also an extremely difficult thing to source. What a nightmare, all of this stuff is so hard to find. Though you'd expect a store in such a big city like St. Petersburg to keep all sorts of bearings in stock. Some types simply don't exist. They're working with a certain assortment, right? What I'm trying to say is that sometimes you'll find the exact same bearing in a Mercedes, a Lada. They're made to be a certain size. So in terms of internal diameter, width, and all of that, what's the plan now? Well, the plan would be to secure the rack. How do you want to go about that? We'll have mounting points in this area. We're about to learn as we go then, eh? You don't quite know. After that, I suggest we apply the dashboard. From there, we place the transmission tunnel shroud, and then we have a look and see. I mean, we could start welding something from here and extend the tunnel to the engine bay. Make as much cage as we possibly can. You notice how when Igor is sure what to do, he talks really fast, but when he doesn't really know, he's like, we have a few options. I need to think about it. Yeah, he like pauses between each and every word, and the more complicated the task at hand, the longer the pauses. What's cool is that we can just work through it. There's always something to work on. If you get stuck in one spot, you move a few feet away and work on something else. So right here, that fell. Here I've got a straight pipe. It isn't welded on. The only thing to do is work while you guys wait. Well, what can I even say? This looks really good. As soon as we added these two pipes for the tunnel, that completely changed the look of the car. Now it's a literal rocket ship, not so much a Lambo. Those two pipes are a nice finishing touch. We've decided that we won't be fitting the plastic. We'll go ahead and drive it just like this. It's not gonna look as good with the panels on. You know, it all looks fairly simple, but you should have seen how much work went into bending those pipes. You have to get it just right for the tunnel shroud to fit. And the fact that the pipe is round makes it even more complicated. So square tubing requires you measure, cut, and that's about it. But when you're joining two pieces of round pipe, you've got some pretty intricate bends happening. I mean, you saw me trimming them, right? Well, yeah, you chop it by 1 millimeter and the angle changes like this much, when you literally removed a tiny bit of material. We finally got the steering rack mounted. We temporarily secured it with some cable ties, since we will be moving it up and down relative to the height of the steering arms. I've noticed that you didn't even hack anything in order to set up a mounting solution. We had a problem in that the tie rods cleared, but the boots didn't. We sorted that with a few minor adjustments. We've begun to test fit the steering column, we tried fitting the dash and the tunnel cover, so the interior is starting to take shape. The whole thing looks like an actual car. As soon as we weld in the cross beams behind the seats, it's going to look complete. Visually, that'll divide the car into two sections, and you'll be looking at it thinking, God, when are we going to finish the build already? With each new pipe we weld on, I'm looking at it thinking, we didn't have this pipe here before, but it's an absolute necessity, like the one you added over there. Most importantly, we've used up, how much is it, 260? About 260, if you don't count all of this. We bought 275 feet of pipe, and we've got 3 20-foot pieces left. The rest is all here. As for how much it weighs, well, you can see that I'm not particularly buff, and even I can easily lift it like this. And that's with most of the weight concentrated up front. That I don't doubt for a second. Yeah, plus you've got the weight of the rack and the knuckles. From there, it's 2 wheels and the panels that barely weigh anything. Wheels, floor panels, but none of that weighs too much. To address the comments about the motor being too weak and underpowered, well, if we were to buy an engine that has 400 horsepower, we'd just have a ton of wheel spin with the car having 2 driven wheels. These types of sports cars tend to be all-wheel drive. I guess you can compare it to a go-kart in that sense. Some of those have just 6 horsepower and they still go like hell. And even when you go up in power a mere 2 horsepower, you can still feel it. And here we've got a 200 horsepower go-kart. So a week has gone by, we've been filming for 3 days, and this entire time we were unable to find any bearings we could use to secure the struts. We'll continue to search for them, and I guess work on the cage in the meantime. We lost a bunch of time because of their weird size. Hopefully we find them. If not, we can always rework the car. When I was getting everything laser cut, I was sure that the diameter was 14 mil. So they cut these bits out, and now we're stuck with a diameter of 14 millimeters, from which there is no getting away, and one thing leads to another, and as a result, we can't finalize the front end. We'll find some kind of solution to the problem, but for now, let's work on the cage. Okay people, I went out and bought those front suspension bearings. Yegor found them and sent me a link, and I carefully read the description when I got there to make sure I get everything right. And upon returning, we learned that they're the wrong bearings. Yeah, we needed 14 on the inside, but these are 12. But why did they give me the wrong ones? It's not like I'm gonna measure them with a ruler, I just took what they gave me. It doesn't say the dimensions on the box. As if they're making it difficult for us on purpose. It just never ends. So instead of assembling the front suspension, we're reinforcing the frame. Yegor is having trouble working out what's the next thing for him to weld on. I can see the question marks in his eyes. They arise because the car is not yet fully assembled, and I don't want to weld something on to then cut it off when it gets in the way. I see you've reinforced the floor, and you're continuing to do something in this area, something really complex. Well, yeah, this is where the engine is gonna be, it'll be pushing the body forward, so this has to be durable. When are you gonna do the cross beams? They're going to be here, correct? That we'll be welding once we finish everything else. It's going to divide the car into 2 sections, and that's going to make it difficult to move around inside the cage. So we'll save that for the very end. We're at day 4 of filming this episode. With us filming every other day, that means that we're entering the 2nd week. Now what do? We can't finish this episode without sorting the front suspension, so what are you up to in this one? We should upload a 30-hour video with me welding the cage. Actually, yeah, imagine putting together all of the footage, the full version of Yegor welding. Nothing but me welding. Yeah, showing every weld in real time so that people stop asking when's the next episode. Some of these pipes take 20 minutes to measure. That's one pipe. All I can offer you is a montage while I go get the right bearings. We've finally reached the glorious point where we scrap the Nissan. The only thing we'll be using from it is the steering rack and the hubs. And that's it. That's true. All of the panels and that thing that I'm not sure you can call a subframe, it's all gone. All that's left are 2 hubs, the rack, 4 hubs, the gauge cluster, engine, and that's pretty much it. Those are all the Nissan bits. Right now we'll be working on the rear suspension. Igor is planning to chop the subframe, make some new frame rails, and start working on the suspension links. Oh right, we're also leaving that big rail thing. Well, that's just for mounting the engine. It'll in no way be tied to the suspension. You remember how hard it was for us to let go of the Nissan when you wanted to cut out the tunnel and I'm like, don't. We were arguing on whether to cut the tunnel out or not. Ilya was like, don't do it, we won't align it later on. And look at where we are now, how far we've come. As for why we are eliminating the subframe, well, if we leave it, we'll have to extend the links, which are already a bit iffy as they are, and so we've decided it's best to make something from scratch. At the very least, we'll get the job done quicker. This is a suspension bit. It's a piece of pipe from a BMW X5 prop shaft. Inside you've got some bearings, and to tighten them down you have to have a spacer in there. We were able to find this thing, but it's an improper length, meaning we have to cut it. But we need to do that evenly so that the bearings stay parallel. How do you do that in a garage when you don't have a lathe? You slide it onto something that allows it to spin around freely. We secure it like so. Okay, and so now we have rotation. Now we mark the length and start cutting while lightly pressing on it. It'll start to rotate, and you'll make a perfectly even cut with a hand grinder. From here you can go by hand, but you can already see that the cut is perfect. It's nice and even, just like we want it, as if we were actually using a lathe. Half a month's worth of work has already gone into the filming of this episode, and so we decided to end it right here. The time has come to do that. I mean, we can go ahead and keep filming, but we're not going to be approaching any sort of logical conclusions, and all because we're constantly running into some kind of trouble. We would have to cut out a bunch of stuff that we'd have loved to show you, but couldn't because the episode would have been too long for anybody to sit through. There was a bunch of monotonous activities such as measuring, cutting, and calculating. In the end, we've put together custom front and rear suspensions. Without those Nissan subframes, there's no Nissan left in there. It's all pipe and square tubing, and all DIY. As for where we stand, well, Igor has almost finished welding up the cage. Most of the outlines are there, with just a few cross pieces left to weld in, which you're still contemplating with the car not fully assembled. The thing is that when you're working on the undressed car, you're risking the plastic being displaced by something. How much of a percentage is that? I take it 70 to 80 or something along those lines, right? Yep, all it needs are some finishing touches. We also have the complete front suspension. We just need to finalize the welds, bolt everything down, and do the final adjustments, by which I mean the alignment. The rear suspension design is done, but you haven't implemented it quite yet because we are waiting on the eyelets. We are lacking a few parts. We put so much work into them, we had them ordered, then we had to revise them, and this just never ends. Still, though, the rear suspension is almost complete. Most importantly, we have a subframe, and all of the dimensions measured up. I'm puzzled as to why it doesn't drive yet. It seems simple enough, right? You come on over and you're like, yeah, I'll get this done by the end of the day, but in reality you spent a bunch of time on something minor, parts didn't fit, angles were off, time was wasted. You just saw this video which accounts for 15 days of our time. That's actually a long time, man. So many things happened happened in here. You can't even start to imagine how much pain Igor is in. When I come back to the garage after going somewhere, I see the lost expression in his eyes, with so much time having passed and a few pipes welded on to show for it. Without a doubt, Igor is working, so he's still with us, but the process is very complicated. I could never have imagined how hard this is.
This fills me with rage sometimes, like seriously. I am doing actual work here, there's a lot going on. I find myself always doing something.
On top of that, you know what you're doing. You're not an amateur.
There were certain days when I would come in and be like, I'll work on the suspension later, but now I'll weld on a few pipes. 1, 2, and it's 8 p.m. Time for me to go home.
We're gonna go ahead and wrap this one up. Next time, the Lambo will be a rolling chassis. I mean, there's not much left until we get there. Just a few minor things to assemble, a bit of welding. But then again, we always say that, don't we? But now we're closer than ever.
It's not gonna have an engine, but it'll roll like a Flintstones car, yeah.
Yeah, we do a pedal conversion. That should work. But for now, that's it. Big thanks for tuning in, and hopefully you enjoyed watching this episode. See you soon.
Bye.